Beyond these gates, in a pond far, far away, exist many, many little frogs. Now, if you're anything like me, you are probably curious how frogs are formed. What is the metamorphosis, or the change that occurs in order for an adult frog to exist? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about frogs to begin. First of all, did you know that a frog is an amphibian? An amphibian is an animal that lives in the water and on land. Unlike humans, frogs have the rare ability to adapt to the water or the temperature around them. This is known as being cold-blooded. Alright, so let's talk about these cold-blooded creatures that coexist on land and water. There are 5 stages from which a frog is formed. These are the stages. Today we're talking about the life cycle of a frog, or frog metamorphosis, how an adult frog comes to be. The first stage of frog metamorphosis is the egg. Many of you did not know that eggs actually come from frogs. It is the first stage. Frogs lay their eggs in water or wet places. A floating clump of eggs is called a frog spawn. Then the large and slippery mass of eggs are too big to be eaten, and so this is nature's way of protecting them. However, the smaller clumps of eggs will be eaten by creatures living near the pond, such as ducks, fish, or insects, other water creatures. The egg begins as a single cell. Several thousand are sometimes laid at once. It becomes surrounded by a jelly-like covering which protects the egg. The female may or may not stay with the eggs to take care of the young after she has laid them, but the egg slowly develops. This is the first stage of frog metamorphosis. The second stage of frog metamorphosis is when the egg cell splits. The single cell in the egg eventually splits into 2, and these 2 split, making 4 cells, and so on. Eventually, there are many cells in the egg. Inside that egg is also known the embryo. The massive cells in the egg come to form an embryo. Organs and gills begin to form, and in the meantime, the embryo lives off of its internal yolk. This supplies it with nutrients for 21 days. This concludes the cell-splitting embryo form. In stage 3, a tadpole sprouts from the embryo. After the 21-day development period, the embryo leaves its jelly shell and attaches itself to a weed in the water. This quickly becomes a tadpole, or also known as a baby frog. The tad will grow until they are big enough to break free into the water. This can take from 3 to 3 weeks. 3 days to 3 weeks, depending on what kind of frog they will become. They eat small plants and stick to larger plants. These tiny plants are known as algae. The tadpole has a long tail and it lives in the water. It is extremely vulnerable and must rely on its camouflage to protect it. The long tail helps the tadpole live in the water. They face danger by being eaten by other water animals, so sometimes the pond dries up, and this is, as a result, is why some tadpoles don't. In stage 4, the tadpole begins to change. After about 5 weeks, the tadpole slowly starts to grow hind legs, which are soon followed with 4 legs. Behind their head, bulges appear where their front legs are growing. Their tails become smaller, and lungs begin to develop, preparing the frog for its life on land. Now and then they wiggle to the surface to breathe in air, but the tail becomes larger and makes it now possible for the tadpole to swim around and catch food. They eat plants and decaying animal matter. Some tadpoles eat frogs, eggs, and other tadpoles. In there, we're almost there. Over time, this tadpole becomes even more frog-like. They have shed their skin and lips. The mouth is now wide open and it loses its horny jaws. The tail becomes much smaller and legs grow. The lungs are almost functioning at this point. At this point, the tadpole has become a baby frog, and now our final stage is an adult frog. 11 weeks after the egg has been laid, a fully developed frog with lungs, legs, and no tail emerges from the water. This frog will mostly live on land with occasional swims. The tiny frogs begin to eat insects and worms. Eventually, it will find a mate. The way this is done varies depending on the species. The female lays the eggs, the male fertilizes them, and the whole process begins again.